When it comes to contentment in your life, that contentment is not a destination that you arrive at, but it is the way in which you choose to travel. I am reminded of a motivational speaker named Dr. Banks that my father in my childhood had a cassette tape for. You. That tells you how old I am, I guess, that he had a cassette tape, and we would listen to it oftentimes. And on that cassette, Dr. Banks told the story of once going to a very nice beach resort, and he sat outside of the resort at a poolside, and while he was there, he began to do what he often did. He people watched and saw what others around him were doing. And in no time at all, he noticed a very wealthy businessman who seemed to have everything life could offer, from the $50,000 Rolex to the most comfortable seat. And he was staying in the presidential suite and had all the nicest things that it seemed like life had to offer. And yet, as he watched that rich gentleman, he noticed in a short time that everything that happened to him, it seemed to be something that he was unhappy about. His drink came and it wasn't cold enough. His food came and it wasn't hot enough. His room wasn't as nice as it should have been. And he sat there often throughout his time at the poolside grumbling about what's been happening to the stock market and that things weren't traded in the timing he wanted. And moments later, Dr. Banks looked over and noticed a young boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, and the boy was feeling his way around the edge of the pool, and pretty soon Dr. Banks began to realize, oh, that kid's blind. And so he was figuring out where the perimeter and the boundaries of it were. And the boy's mother sat there and spoke to him, and the boy asked her, what did the weather look like? What did the setting look like? And she described the beautiful, picturesque ocean air that was flowing in and the light that was glimmering off of the water, and just what a beautiful place they were at. And soon enough, that little boy, he jumped out into the pool, and when he hit the pool, he let out a gleeful, childlike laugh, just celebrating this moment, this chance that he has to actually spend some time in a swim pool. And in that moment, Dr. Banks realized that little boy knew more about contentment than that older man had ever learned. It wasn't a matter of eyesight. It was a matter of insight. The man who had everything could see nothing to be grateful for. And the boy who could see nothing found everything to be appreciative of. And folks, I want to warn you today, I think many of us live in that same tension between those 2 points. And far too often, we are like that rich man, having so many opportunities, having so many blessings that fall on our lap, and yet viewing and seeing none of them, and instead deciding to focus and orient our life around everything we wish we had and everything we felt like we should have had more of. Our discontentment can drive us to some of the craziest, most tragic decisions in our life if we don't control it. And yet, if we learn that principle, that contentment, it isn't actually a place that someday you might arrive, but it is a way in which you choose to travel where you are going today. When that principle is realized in our life, everything we see can become different as a result of it. Today, in our Bible passage, we are going to see this principle lived out in some pretty big ways. We're going to be able to draw comparison and contrast. We are continuing on, really drawing near the end of Joseph's life as we continue our study of the book of Genesis. And so if you have your Bibles, I want to encourage you to grab them and open them up to Genesis chapter 45. We're actually going to be moving through a lot of this passage today. We're going to go through a couple chapters, and we're going to skip a genealogy in the middle of it, and we'll talk about that as we go. But I want to encourage you now and grab your Bibles. If you don't have one, you can grab one from the seat in front of you. In fact, if you don't own a Bible at all, then I want to encourage you to grab that Bible, and you can even take it home as our gift to you. We don't think anybody should be without God's Word. If you're using it, it's going to look just like mine. And you'll be on roughly page 49 if you're in that pew Bible. If not, I bet it'll be somewhere in that area. So just as a reminder, we've been talking about the life of Joseph, and Joseph's had some hardships. He was kidnapped by his brothers when he was a young kid. They beat him mercilessly because he was daddy's favorite, and they sold him as a slave. Excuse me. And then they lied to their father and said he'd been eaten by a wild beast. They brought home a bloodied jacket and said, oh, something must have got him. And so he was hauled off to Egypt and lived a rough life for the next 13 years as a slave in a man's house, and then continuing on. and being locked in prison afterwards until ultimately God took him and reversed his fortunes and raised him up to the point where he was the vizier of Egypt. And in our last chapter, we saw Joseph revealed to his brothers who he was. He had tested them to see if they had changed their character from those original savage people who sold him into slavery. And he deduced from testing them that they had. And then he revealed that he was their brother and that God had used these terrible events in order to save the lives of millions of people, because God had given Pharaoh a vision and Joseph the ability to interpret it that revealed that Egypt would have 7 great years of bumper crops and great food available, and then 7 years that were so bad you'd forget the first 7 ever happened. And so Joseph helped institute a program of saving and storing food for that calamity when it came, which now we're 2 years into. So Joseph instructed his brothers to go get their dad and bring him home, and we'll see that's where we're going to pick up today. We're going to hear the story of Joseph's father, Jacob, who he has not seen now in 22 years, hearing about his son being alive, traveling back to Egypt, and them getting settled into this new country where they'll have food and they'll have safety. So we'll begin at verse 16. Before I begin reading, I'll ask you to join me for just a moment of prayer so we can reorient our hearts. Heavenly Father, there are 1,000 little things that could steal our attention this morning, and yet, Lord, what we're going to talk about is so important. It could ruin some of our futures if we don't get it. And so I pray today you'd speak through your Spirit, through your word, to our hearts. Help us to see how you were at work then and how you want to be in our lives now. I thank you, and I pray these things in Jesus Christ's name, Lord. Amen. Okay, so Genesis chapter 45, verse 16. This is where we left off last week. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." You are also directed to tell them, "Do this, take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father to come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all of Egypt will be yours." So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts, and as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread, and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, "Don't quarrel on the way." So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is the ruler of Egypt." Jacob was stunned, and he did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, "I am convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Incidentally, as we're reading through this, if you're newer to the book of Genesis, I want to point out Jacob is the birth name of the person we're talking about, but God, when he had an encounter with God and became a believer, God renamed him Israel because he's actually going to be the father of the nation of Israel. Interestingly, that name literally means one who wrestles with God, which is intriguing because it seems to imply those of us who follow God often wrestle through things with him. We're not often quick to accept what God says, and sometimes we have to have it out with him a little bit before we fall in line, which sadly sounds pretty true. So as we look at that passage, going back to the top, we see that Pharaoh hears what's going on and is actually encouraged about it. This Joseph guy has saved his kingdom. This would have been a mess if Joseph hadn't been able to interpret that dream and if he hadn't so consistently and reliably led the kingdom since. And so Pharaoh feels a sense of gratitude. And with that, he says to Joseph, look at man, go get your family. If they're here, that is awesome. Go get them, invite them to come out here. We will give them the best land that we have. And tell them they don't even need to pack their stuff. If they just bring along whatever they have easy at hand, I'll replace anything they don't have. I'll give them the best Egypt has to offer. And this is a significant offer in a time frame where most of the world is struggling with starvation and is coming to Egypt just to beg for food because they actually stored grain. We see that here for Joseph's family, they're going to be in this place where they're going to have food and be taken care of. In fact, not only are they going to have the food, but Pharaoh even sends several of his carts to go haul the young kids and Jacob himself. Jacob, who is Joseph's father, is at this point in time 130 years old. And so he's probably beyond the let's ride a horse for 3 weeks, 300 miles away on a journey stage of his life. And so the brothers take all these resources, the food and everything else that's given. They're even given new clothes to wear as they go down there. And you notice that Benjamin, the only one of the brothers who didn't help sell Joseph into slavery, gets not only 5 sets of clothing, but also 300 shekels of silver. It's interesting to note, Joseph, when his brothers sold him as a slave, they only made 20 shekels of silver out of it. And so you've got, 11 times as much wealth being given here to his brother for that. So they head down, and understandably, when they get to their father, they tell him, hey, Dad, we got some news for you. Joseph, who you thought was dead, he's actually alive. He not only is he alive, but he's the most powerful man in Egypt, with the exception of Pharaoh, and he's running everything down there. And understandably, Jacob responds to that basically with disbelief. For over 20 years now, he's firmly believed his son was dead. They brought back a blood-stained coat that belonged to Joseph to prove it. They did that to try to cover up the fact that they had sold him as a slave themselves, but still, it was pretty convincing evidence. And you have to wonder, at year 1 or 2, odds are good that Jacob still hoped that someday Joseph would wander back through that door, that maybe he'd come home, that maybe whatever happened would be undone. But 22 years later, is there any hope left? No. Not in an era where most people are lucky if they live 35 or 45 years. The average lifespan was around 35. If you were 45 in their culture, you were an old man. And so here we are 22 years later, and he's not seen this. But as they tell him this account, and as he looks out and notices all the treasures that have been brought from Egypt, and the Pharaoh's own carts that have been brought out, and all the animals that have been given to him, well, that's evidence. And so he starts to actually believe this and buy into the idea. And so we can see he starts to get actually excited about that and is excited about the idea of going and seeing his son. So that's exactly what's going to happen next. Let's continue at chapter 46, verse 1. So Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to God, the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport him. So Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and their possessions that they had acquired in Canaan. Jacob brought with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons and his daughters and granddaughters, all of his offspring. So Jacob has began the journey to go see Joseph, but on the way he stops in a town called Beersheba. And this is an interesting place for him to stop because this is a place that both his father and grandfather at different points in their lives lived. But actually, for Jacob, this was the place that he was at in his childhood when he scandalously went and coerced his older brother into giving his birthright to him, and then went and actually tricked his father and his dad, and stole his father's blessing as well. And it was that event that caused him to actually run away to a foreign land to hide there. And so this was, in a sense, his hometown. And while he's there, he drops by and he goes ahead and he offers a sacrifice to God, which makes a lot of sense. There's a lot happening here. And so he wants to give a gift to God and ask God for wisdom and guidance. And God shows up and gives exactly that. God comes and visits him, calls out his name, and he gives him some assurances here, which would be very valuable in his position. In verse 3, he says, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there." So, number one, yes, you are safe to go to Egypt. This is actually part of my plan. And point number 2 in that sentence is actually your family and your descendants are going to live there for quite some period of time until I've actually grown them into a nation of their own. So they're going to reproduce and become a full-blown country. And of course, by the time that Moses is composing this document under God's inspiration, that's already been fulfilled. These are the very children of Jacob that are now numbering around 2.5 million that are living in this place 300 years later, and now God is set free to come and start a new life. Now, verse 4 adds to that. He says, "I will go down to Egypt with you." Well, that should be comforting, because anytime God goes with you, that's a good place to be. "And I will surely bring you back again." This is actually true in 2 senses. So Jacob himself will die in Egypt, but his children will take him and return his body to Canaan, to the burial tomb purchased by his grandfather Abraham as a burial spot for his wife, which is now served for a burial spot for Abraham and his wife, Isaac and his wife, and someday for Jacob and one of his wives, at least, Leah. So they'll all be returned there. So he will return to Canaan in that sense when he's buried. But also, God is promising through this, your nation, this nation that comes from you, this people of Israel, I'm going to take them and bring them back to Canaan. Canaan's been promised to the people of Israel already for hundreds of years that someday this will become their land. And yet, here they are, just a small family at this point. And so God's saying, I'll fulfill that promise too. And I will give that land over to you and fulfill my promises that way. And then the last verse is a point of comfort. And you have to wonder if there was any little bit of skepticism in Jacob's mind left of, is Joseph still alive? When God says, oh yeah, and Joseph will be there. And in effect, he's saying, as you die, he will be at your bedside holding your hand. Well, this is his kid he thought was dead. And so the idea that this child he thought was dead will be there, will be comforting him with his family when he dies. Okay, so he'll be in a place where he can find some peace as he goes down there. All right, verse 8, we are not going to continue on from. So verse 8 is where there's a genealogy. And let me just point out, the genealogy is significant, but for the sake of time saving, I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself at home if you wish to. There's 2 things that really jump out at our attention from genealogies in the book of Genesis. Number 1, it's good to note, typically genealogies are present in this book at transition points where the narrative is going to move on. Oftentimes, when we stop focusing on Isaac and we focus on Jacob instead, for example, we had a genealogy in between those. And so that means we're hitting a transition point in the book of Genesis. But more than that, this genealogy lays out all the children of Jacob who are going to be the people who begin the nation of Israel. And when they go back and settle in Canaan, these genealogies are going to be essential because who you are and where you live and the property you have, all those things are going to be defined by whose descendant you are. And so descendancy in Israel is going to be a critical thing, and they would find it highly valuable to have this genealogy. Now, for our purposes, it's not going to add a lot to the narrative, so we're going to actually pick back up at verse 28 after that genealogy's been given, and we'll read through the end of the chapter. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get direction to Goshen. When he arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet with his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father, and he wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and speak to Pharaoh, and I will say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household, who were living in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, what is your occupation? You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Now that last verse there, saying all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians, kind of an interesting bit of history behind that. Many scholars who wish to disprove the Bible had said for years that the Bible made this up. There's no evidence that anybody in Egypt disliked shepherds. Interestingly, as is so often the case, as we've uncovered more Egyptian writings, we found writings from ancient Egyptians saying exactly that. They were speaking very negatively and diminutively of shepherds and cattlemen and things like that. And so this is actually a phenomenon that occurred. We don't know exactly why the Egyptians hated shepherds as much as they did, but in their mind, these people were kind of the caste of society. This was not something you did if you wanted to be important, was be a shepherd. So we see in a touching moment at the beginning of that passage, of that section, in verse 28, that Judah sent ahead. He's supposed to go help get directions to Goshen because, shockingly, they're not from Egypt, so they needed to know where to go. Now, we know the rough region of Goshen. It's on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. It's actually several miles from Egypt itself, but it is the best grazing land in all of Egypt. And so that's part of why Jacob is sending them there. And we see, or why Joseph is sending them there. And we see Joseph arrives, and he and his dad lock eyes. And man, that must have been a crazy moment because, again, Jacob probably never thought he would see Joseph again. As far as he was concerned, it was a given that he was dead. Even if he had known the truth that he'd been sold as a slave in Egypt, it would have been unbelievable that he would have lived through that and somehow still survived it because the lifespan of a slave in Egypt was not very high. You were treated as expendable labor, quite literally by them. And for Joseph's part, he had a vision in his childhood where he saw that his brothers would all bow down to him, but his mom and dad weren't there. And actually, his mom already died before he was sold off as a slave. And unbeknownst to him, his grandfather has passed away since the time that he was in captivity in Egypt. So he's already lost some family members. We notice that he's very concerned in past dialogue with his brothers, asking, okay, is my dad, is he really alive though? Is he really there? So here in this moment, his dad, who really loved him deeply and never wronged him, his dad is here, and we see this touching moment where he just runs up to his dad. You know, even though he's in his 30s now, how many years has he just wished he could run into his dad's arm and shed some tears and get a comforting hug? And so in that moment, he gets exactly that. And the two men sit there sobbing in each other's arms, grateful for this thing that seemed impossible, for this moment where they can actually be in each other's presence again. Now, after that touching moment, we'll see that Jacob responds and says, now I'm ready to die since I have seen for myself that you're still alive. To be clear, this is not him saying he wishes to die. This is him saying, in effect, I could die happy now that I know you're alive. This is one of the worst wounds of his entire life. To lose a child is a very difficult and challenging thing. I've walked through that with some of you. It's not easy. It doesn't seem natural at all for a parent to outlive their kid. And so when you walk through that, for him to have this, and then suddenly it's not the case against all odds, what a blessing. He's basically saying, I can die at peace now. That's great. Now notice Joseph then gives instructions to his brothers. He's telling them how this work before Pharaoh's court is going to work. And these guys are, even though they've had some wealth when they were back in Canaan, these guys have not been standing before kings really often, and Joseph needs to brief them. And there's probably a few things that he has in mind with that. Number one, he's really emphasizing, hey, I'm going to tell him that you're shepherds, and you guys should tell him you're shepherds. There's probably a few things behind that. Number one, it's true, so that's handy. These guys have been shepherds most of their life. This has been the way they've made their living, so it's an honest response. But also, Pharaoh might be trying to assess, are these guys a threat? Are they likely to cause any issues? And shepherds are not synonymous with warriors, so he's not going to be worried about that. But a third thing happening here that's kind of interesting is, by Joseph doing this, as we noted, since shepherds are looked down on and not viewed favorably, Pharaoh is not going to try to incorporate any of them into any industry that he has. And so they are not going to become absorbed into the greater Egyptian society, which is very critical if someday there's going to be a nation that comes from these guys. If they all came in and they were jewelers by trade, for example, well, Pharaoh would probably say, yeah, I could use more jewelers. Come on in, make stuff for me. That's great. I got lots of gold and you can make lots of cool stuff. Let's do this. But that isn't their occupation. And so they're going to be actually sent off to a place far, far away where we keep the shepherds at, because none of us like those. That's kind of the Egyptian perspective. But by doing so, it'll actually protect their autonomy, and they will be able to grow as an individual people, which is necessary for God's word to be fulfilled here. So he's given them this briefing. This is what you're to say. We're going to go into chapter 47, and we're going to read two brief sections. The first one is going to be how Joseph's brothers handle that. And then we're going to see how Jacob, his father, handles interacting with Pharaoh. And that's where our passage is really going to hinge on. So chapter 47, verse 1. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and brothers, with their flocks and herds and everything they own, have come down from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." They also said to him, "We have come to live here for a while because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now, please let your servants settle in Goshen." Pharaoh said to Joseph, Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your family and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." Okay, so Joseph has narrowed down to just 5 of his brothers. He doesn't need all 11 of them there. And so he handpicks the 5 he thinks are going to be best at being in the royal court. They have their new clothes. That's handy. Most people own 1 pair of clothes at most, and they got a bunch of royal clothing they were just handed. So they come before Pharaoh, present themselves before him, and he asks those basic questions that were anticipated. What do you guys do for a living? We're shepherds. We're a part of a family of shepherds. Generationally, this is what we do. We'd love it if we could stay in Goshen. And that's what he allows them to do. He says, "That's great. I'll let you guys do that." And he even as a side note tells Joseph, "Hey man, if any of these guys are truly exceptional at shepherding, let me know and I'll have them take care of my flocks too." I would actually give them a job to go with it. And we don't know if that's ever taken up or not. But the family is allowed to make the settlement. The brothers play their cards honestly and exactly as they should have. And so Pharaoh has given carte blanche to Joseph to say, find the best place there is in all of Goshen, and that's where your family goes. Because you're so critical to the kingdom of Egypt, they get the best that we possibly have to offer. Now, on its face, we're hearing this is happening, but just to keep in mind, this is a stark contrast from where these folks were just a few days ago. It wasn't long ago they didn't have food, and all their animals were starving to death, and they had no idea how they were going to get to the next meal for them or their livestock. Now, while everybody else in the world is still dealing with starvation, these people who are descended from Jacob, these brothers of Joseph, they've been welcomed into the most luscious, luxurious place in all of Egypt. They've been told, hey, don't worry about anything. We're going to give you the material resources you need. We're going to make sure you're taken care of. And they've been put in this place where they won't have to worry about how to eat tomorrow. While others are starving, they for sure are going to be taken care of. And they're in this great position. And if that wasn't good enough, beyond that even, their brother is the vizier of Egypt. He's the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Functionally, he's the one running it on a day-to-day basis. Boy, this is a pretty good spot to be. He went from not having anything to having everything. I would say that's something to give thanks for. All right, now let's go ahead and we'll pick up at verse 7. We're going to finish out by reading Jacob's response and his interactions with Pharaoh. So let's start at verse 7. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out of his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them the property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their children. Now, one footnote before we dive fully into that. It talks about the district of Ramses, and that phrase, again, by secular or skeptical scholars, they've often said this Ramses II is the most famous Ramses, and he wouldn't have been alive clear back at the time that Jacob and Joseph were alive. And so why are we referring to a region by that name when that probably wasn't the common name of that region at the time? And let me just point out two things with this. Number one, Ramses I would have been alive within their lifetime, so it's possible that it's named that after him. But number two, it is Moses who 300 plus years later is composing this document under God's inspiration. And if the region of Ramses is the common name in his time frame, it would make sense not for him to use an ancient name for the land that was no longer used, but to use the current name for it, to refer to it to his contemporary audience. So to give an example of that, if I were talking about things that happened very early in the development of New York City, I would probably refer to it as New York City, despite the fact that in its earliest years, it was actually called New Amsterdam. But if I started talking to you about New Amsterdam, you'd probably think that was weird. You wouldn't know where I was talking about. But if I say New York City, you suddenly do know. And so, again, normally we use the name that people use in our culture for the things that we're talking about around us. It does not dismiss the veracity of the Bible that Moses does that. If anything, it adds to it. He is speaking to a contemporary audience and using contemporary language to do that. That makes perfect sense that he would do such a thing. Okay, now going back to the actual events, we see Jacob has his appearance before Pharaoh, and rightly he starts off by praying a blessing over Pharaoh. Pharaoh has been incredibly generous to Jacob and to his kids, despite owing them nothing. He might feel like he owes Joseph something, but just because one person in your company did really well for you, that doesn't mean you have to give free stuff to all their family members. I mean, it doesn't hurt, right? But it's not expected. And so Jacob is showing gratitude here. That's good. And yet, after that, Pharaoh asks what's a pretty intuitive question, especially considering his age. He asks, hey man, how old are you? And I know that might be considered rude, but when you have a 130-year-old guy standing before you, it's an understandable question to ask. Not many of us have stood before a 130-year-old. And so he asks, hey, Jacob, how old are you? And notice Jacob's summary of his life before Pharaoh here. In verse 9, he says, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. So he's being accurate there. That's his lifespan. And my years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Now, he is literally correct that he has not at this point lived as long as his father Isaac or his grandfather Abraham. Isaac would live to be 180 years old, and Abraham lived to be 175. Now, he's only at 130. But again, in this culture, if you lived to be 45, you were an old man. And so if you're 130, you're three times that. You're doing okay. And yet in his life, he's saying, man, life has been hard. Things have been rough. And it's hard here, but, and I haven't lived as long as my dad, so it's not great. That's a tough summary. And I just want to talk about this for a moment. I think you and I have a tendency to do this same thing oftentimes. Just to create a contrast, though, I find it interesting to look back. When you look back at Joseph, when he revealed who he was to his brothers, Joseph, one of the first things he said was, guys, look, it may have been you who took me and it may have been you who sold me into slavery, but you need to understand God used those events. You don't need to blame yourself. God used those events to save the lives of millions of other people and to save the lives of you. So don't feel bad about that. Well, if anyone in the world was to blame for Joseph being sold as a slave, it was obviously his brothers. They're literally the ones who did it. And yet Joseph is putting his whole life into this perspective where he says, I know you guys are a part of that. Forgive yourselves. I forgive you because God used those broken circumstances to lead me to be able to interpret Pharaoh's vision and be able to come up with a plan where millions of lives would be saved, and now my own family can be saved. He saw all of that through a positive light. And yet Jacob, now that even knowing his son's alive, is going and summarizing his life as, man, it's been rough and it's been hard and it's not as long as I wanted it to be. And so let's just draw a contrast between those two lives for a moment. Let me say on the surface, there is actually a fair amount of the coarser details that overlap between Jacob and his son Joseph. First of all, both of them in their youth had tension between their siblings and their family that ultimately led to both of them spontaneously leaving the country of their origin and ending up in a foreign land. Both of them lived in that foreign land for over 20 years, and then both of them made an effort to reconcile with their families afterwards. So a very interesting, similar story arc between those two lives, and yet those are the points where the details stop. After this, it all becomes quite different. Because you see, for Joseph's part, Joseph didn't do anything wrong. He didn't sin in some grievous way that it necessitated him being beaten and sold as a slave, and yet that's exactly what happened to him. And that's why he ended up in Egypt. But for Jacob, the father's part, he went and stole his father's blessing and coerced out the birthright, caused a big amount of drama in his family. He wasn't listening to God. He wasn't doing what God said. He just did things his own way, and he wanted it, so he was going to take it. And that's what caused the drama. He had to leave and flee and go away to Haran, to the land of his uncle, in order to escape the consequences of his own actions. And when he gets to Haran, he's there, and in no time at all, he only has 4 wives, but he's become exceedingly wealthy. By many people's standards, it seems like life is good for him. He's got his freedom. He's able to continue to accrue wealth and be comfortable, and he's starting families. And all of this is happening with God's blessing, despite the fact that he's not even faithfully following God. Well, in that same time frame, poor Joseph, he's sold off, and the only good thing that happens to him is the first house he's enslaved in, he works himself up to being the leader of the house, to being head of the other slaves. But in no time at all, he is falsely accused by Potiphar, his owner's wife, of being somebody who tried to sexually assault her. And in fact, the opposite is true. She tried to sexually assault him. And he's thrown in jail and stuck in that pit for years on end. And even when he thinks that maybe he's going to get out of it, he goes and he interprets these dreams for these 2 influential people and begs them, hey, when you get out of here, tell the king that I'm falsely accused, that I shouldn't have been put in here. They don't remember that. It takes 2 more years before Joseph is ever set free. And then they go and they return home. And for Jacob's part, he returns home. And when he goes back, he is so wealthy from all the blessing God has given him that he can give away hundreds of cattle and livestock to his brother, and it doesn't even hurt his bottom line. I mean, we're in the wealthiest society in the history of humanity, and most of us in this room could not give away 100 cattle without feeling it, right? That would be a big deal. Even those of you who own cattle. I don't even have a cow, so it would really hurt. I'd have to find 100 cows before I could do it. And beef prices are up pretty high right now, so that makes it even worse. But if you had to give away 100 cows tomorrow, it would probably wreck your financial world a bit. He is in such a luxurious position, Jacob, that he can just give it away, and it's not a big deal to him. And once he's back, he reconciles. God allows him to reconcile with his brother. God tells him to return to his home. He doesn't. Instead, he goes off and does his own thing, which causes drama among his siblings. In fact, one of the hardest things he's endured is the loss of his son Joseph. But part of why that happens is his own fault. It was him playing favoritism. His brothers knew, and we've seen throughout this entire story, that at every turn, their dad's been clear. Boy, Joseph and Benjamin, his younger brother Benjamin, those are the kids I love, and I don't even know if I count the rest of you as my sons. That created the tension. He created the tension that ultimately resulted in Joseph being sold as a slave. And so there's an irony here when we compare these lives. If you ask me, would you rather live through the life of Joseph or live through the life of Jacob? I mean, I wouldn't want Jacob's sin, but his life looks a lot more comfortable. I would choose that for sure. And yet here Jacob is at the end of his life, having just realized his son is alive and being reconnected with him, having just been given the most luxurious land and food that Egypt has to offer. And his summary of those events are, man, this life's been hard and miserable, and I haven't got to live very long at all. It's pretty rough. Folks, I want to suggest to you, many of us are living with that same heart. And it's not that God hasn't given you good things, and it's not that he hasn't put before you good opportunities. It's that you and I are not opening our eyes to see them. We are refusing contentment because we can always find some excuse to be upset and to think that we should have had more. So I created a list for you today, and there's a document just outside the double doors. This is my words, not the Bible's, but this is just some simple, practical things. As I've walked through this with a lot of people, that I think would help you as you're working on contentment. You'll see the principles up on the screen, but like I said, you can grab this handout as you walk out the doors if you want to. There's even homework on it. There's an application you can do on a daily basis this week. So I've got 3 principles that should supercharge your contentment. Number 1, the story you choose is the lens that you use. What I'm getting at with this is every one of us tell ourselves stories about our life on a day-to-day basis. And I bet that we've all encountered people who are walking through their life, and every time something goes wrong, all they do is complain about it and see every negative side of everything. And so you hear people all the time say things like, yeah, man, the system's just fixed. The little guy can't get ahead. Every time I feel like I'm on a good track, then something just comes and it crushes it and it destroys it. And their car breaks down, and they're just talking about how this is such a cruel world. And if they didn't have bad luck, they wouldn't have any luck at all. And so when events happen in their life, they interpret those events through that lens. And so they're constantly, perpetually telling themselves, I'm the victim, the world is fixed against me, nothing can work for me. And if you choose to tell yourself that story about your life, it's going to always feel like it's true, because everything that happens in your life, you're going to interpret that way. By contrast, if you chose to tell yourself as you went through that, you might notice some things. If you chose to focus on God instead and on the narrative of what God is doing, you might notice, you know what? It was terrible that my car broke down, but thank God that somebody had recently given me a gift and I had enough money I could pay for the repair. Or how about, thank God that the repair wasn't too expensive. That could have wrecked me, but thankfully they could fix it for a few $100s. I found an honest mechanic. I can be grateful for that. Or how about, man, isn't it great that God put me in this position where I have some friends and actually have a few people in the world who trust me enough to do something crazy and loan me their car for 2 weeks while my car is getting repaired. That's a wonderful place to be. When you have things happen in your life, you can tell yourself various stories about it. And some of those stories are not biblical at all. Here's the fact of the matter. You aren't your own. You were bought at a price. This world is not your home. This life is not the end of it. And Jesus did tell you, trial, tribulation, and persecution, suffering were going to be a part of your existence here. And yet, greater is he that is in you than he who is in the world. And yes, your fight, it might seem like it's against flesh and blood, but it's not. It's against supernatural forces that are at work here. And yet, Christ, the ultimate fulfillment of God's love, has died and paid the price for your sin. And even if you suffer in the here and now, the true story is you will spend eternity in heaven if you are in Jesus Christ, apart from all of this. This is just a blip. It's just your eternal adolescence, but eternity awaits for you. And if you can live in the perspective of Scripture, realizing that this here and now isn't it, but there and then is everything, well then, a car breaking down won't be the end of the world. When things go wrong, it'll be the end. The story you choose is the lens that you'll use to interpret the world. And my application for that is you can't always choose your circumstances, but you can choose your narrative. Tell your story in light of God's faithfulness, not your frustration. Remind yourself daily, God is writing something redemptive in me, even here and now, even when it's hard. Principle number 2, and these are going through your perception, your protection of your contentment, and your production of contentment. So now we're looking at the protection of your contentment. Comparison is the biggest killer of you and I's contentment out there. When you and I judge our life by the way people look like they're living on social media, which is a lie, by the way, but the way they're living on social media. When you and I judge our lives in comparison to everybody else, when we say to ourselves, if I just had a wife like that, I'd be happy. If I just had a job like that, I'd be happy. If I just made this much money, I'd be okay. If people just treated me like they treat her or him, then I'd be all right. We walk around our lives all the time playing this game, telling ourselves that our contentment, that our peace, that our happiness is some place we might arrive at eventually, when actually it's the way we choose to live in the here and now. When we live that way, we rob ourselves of our contentment. I listened to an interviewer with a guy who was an expert in happiness the other day, and he was talking about in his own life that he sold some books that have been on the bestseller list, and recently with the added money, he and his wife went and they sold their old house, and they moved into a new neighborhood with a fancier house. And they had had a 5-year or so old Toyota car they've been really happy with, had never broken down on them, had treated them really well. But when they got into that new neighborhood that was a little higher brow than the old one, they looked around and they noticed there's a Mercedes, there's a Porsche. Man, there's just fancy cars everywhere here. There's a BMW. And suddenly they started feeling like, man, we don't have a nice car. We need a new vehicle. This is really sad that we're in this state where we're suffering like this. And you realize pretty quickly that even the good things he had from God, he wasn't noting them as good because he was comparing it to everybody else. His car had been reliable. It kept his family safe. But in that moment, just playing the comparison game, you can lose that. And so with that, I just want to encourage you, refuse to measure your blessings by anybody else's ruler. Comparison replaces contentment with complaint. But when you fix your eyes on Christ, your peace stops depending on anybody else's pace. You can really look at it for what it is. Last thing here, if you want to grow contentment in your life, because again, it's not a place you arrive at, but it's a decision you make in the here and now. If you want to grow contentment in your life, giving thanks is a key thing. You have 1,000 things in your life today that you could give thanks for. I'm giving thanks this morning that I could even get through 2 sermons with my respiratory distress I've been having the last few days. But I'm glad. I know it was an important message and that God allowed me to do that. We have so much God has given us. Again, we live in such an opulent, decadent society. 100 years ago, people would have fantasized about living in a world where your dishes are washed in a machine, where your clothes are washed and dried in a machine. If we could just get that folding machine, we'd really be done, right? Except, no, that's me being discontent, isn't it? But all of these things are done in automated ways. You don't have to spend hours out at a washboard taking care of them. You are in such a privileged place. And by the way, privileged compared to the rest of the world. And yet, the level of discontentment statistically in this country is off the charts higher than so many places that have so much less. Well, why is that? Well, it's because it's not the stuff that makes us happy, it's how we view things. And when we stop for a moment and we come before the Lord in our natural state of giving thanks to Him, of showing gratitude to Him, then that can put our life in perspective. That can help us actually be oriented in the right way. That is a spiritual discipline, but it's something we've got to do. We've got to act with gratitude. So my application for this, if you pick up this sheet, you can do this each day this week. Start and end each day by naming what is good, even small things, and thank God for what's still standing instead of what's been lost. When gratitude becomes your reflex, then joy can become your rhythm. That can become the norm for you. Guys, we are being held captive by our ingratitude. It is leading us to silly decisions in our lives. We are compromising in our families and our marriages and our relationships because we think we have to have more, when really, in the here and now, in this moment, we have so much we can give thanks for. Even if you're just starting out in life, even if you're a broke high school or college student, even then, you have so much you can give thanks for. And when we orient our life that way, then God's blessing follows that much more readily. At this point, I'm going to ask some of our leaders to come forward. They're going to lead us in our time of communion and offering. As they do, I'm going to ask you to join me in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, your blessings are so profound in our lives. Everybody got here safely this morning. Many folks here are healthy, and those who aren't, you are walking through those struggles with them, and to walk through those valleys without a good God present would be insufferable. Thank you that you love us so much. Thank you, more than anything, that you sent your Son to die for us, and you changed everything that way, so that this is not the end of life for us, but in fact, it's just the launching point for an incredible thing you have awaiting in the future. Help us to live here today, telling ourselves the right story, not tearing down the gratitude we should have, and growing with thankfulness. I pray these things in Jesus Christ's name, Lord. Amen.